Today we celebrate All Saints' Day, even though in the prayer book calendar, All Saints' Day is appointed for the first day of November. But for a very long time, the prayer book calendar rules have urged the church to take this feast, and if there isn't a great celebration where most of the people gather on the 1st of November, to move it to the Sunday nearest so that those who gather in the church have the opportunity to reflect on this tremendous event, this tremendous feast day. Often we do this kind of thing when there is something great to be celebrated, something that is, well, beyond the usual sorts of celebrations. And so it gives us pause. So why exactly is it that the church wants us to take the time to reflect on this particular thing, this thing we call the Feast of All Saints? And I think part of it is the fact that it refers to a portion of what we call the creed. The very end of it, usually we're so tired of reciting the creed that when we get to it, we kind of run through it and we don't even think about it. It's called the Communion of Saints. It's one of those terms that we've probably said a gazillion times and really have never thought too much about it. So it's incumbent on us to think a little this morning. Think on the origin, perhaps, of this feast itself, and that might be instructive for us as to why we celebrate it at all. Part of it is we need to realize that most of the church, as we know it in our modern day, had its roots, at least its celebrations, and the way that we celebrate things, in the northern part of our globe. You know, we are a global community today, north and south. And I don't mean in our country, but I mean in the globe. Right now, the southern part of the globe is entering into summertime, just as we are beginning to think about entering into winter. And so it gets really goofy, for example, when at Christmas time we're talking about in the bleak midwinter, snow on snow, hard, cold. When in Australia, it's as hot as it is in mid-July here. But such it as it is. That's the way, for centuries, as the church developed its liturgy, its way of thinking about things, the Western church, particularly Christianity, and particularly Anglicanism, took its roots and its cues from the northern part of Europe in particular. And for us as Episcopalians, as Anglicans, right now in England and in the Nordic countries, this is a time of transition. Now, those of you who watch the evening news, particularly the weather, I've gotten to that point in my life when that's about the only part of the local news that I'm really, really terribly interested in. And I recall my parents, they would flip from channel to channel to catch the weather. What is the weather going to be? And we hear Eric Finkenbinder, particularly, because he's a farmer, so he's very, very particular about the way he forecasts the weather. And he said the other day, this is the end of the growing season. Because the warm weather, we may get a warm day here and there, as we seem to be having just a little bit today. It's a little chilly outside, but it's sunny. And just as before service is about to begin, I was standing outside, and it's still kind of on the warm side. maybe a sweater or a jacket, but it's still warm. But there was frost about last week, and the furnaces all went on as the temperatures dipped into the 20s in the middle of the night. So it's definitely the end of the growing season. Now, for those of us in northern climes, this is a transition time. Now, if we go back far enough, long before, the creatures of the Apple Watch, or any watches at all, or smartphones, or even clocks in our living rooms and kitchens and our bedsides, people told time by where the sun was during the day. People told time in terms of what the calendar was by how high the sun went up or down in the sky, if at all, depending on how far north you were. And so, as we felt today, when we turned our clocks back an hour, this evening you'll find that probably around 5 o'clock it's suddenly very dark outside. Yes, it's a transition time. The darkness begins to surround us. The cold begins to envelop us. It's a time when we become vulnerable. If you haven't got your harvest in the cellar yet, it's probably been destroyed by the frost. And you'll have to look around to make sure that you have enough for the winter. That's how dangerous it used to be. There weren't supermarkets. Things weren't imported from Chile and Israel and the warmer climes. If you didn't do it right, you could starve. Even before Christian missionaries traveled to the north of Europe and into the British Isles, there were people who celebrated these times. In England, the dominant religious system was that of the Druids. And in fact, we just celebrated a big Druid holiday. We call it Halloween. Halloween. Because it was a time of transition. And one of the things about transitions for ancient peoples were that they did feel very vulnerable. And in fact, in those days, times of transitions were times where when things were shifting, they could be considered thin places. And it was at that time that spirits could move between the realms of the spirit and the world in which we lived. And so what Halloween was for the Druids was one of those times that the spirit world and the physical world in which we lived, there was a very thin veil that separated them, and the spirits could move between them very easily. And sometimes those spirits were not great spirits. They weren't happy spirits. They weren't good spirits. And so you had to ward them off. And so come along the Christian missionaries, and they see this happening among the people that they're trying to convince of the rightness of the gospel. And they begin to see an opportunity to talk about the power of Jesus and the power of the gospel and the power of the Spirit. And they begin to see, yes, these thin times are there, but you don't need to worry about them because the power of Christ is beyond them. The power of God's Spirit will always triumph over any evil. The power of God's Spirit will destroy any evil spirit that might make it through that thin veil. And so is born the Feast of All Saints. A time when we think about the grace of God and how the grace of God infiltrates our lives. And not our lives only, but the created world in which we live. And we hear the words of Jesus not too soon after the words that we read today, when Jesus says, "The kingdom of God is among you. The kingdom of God is within you." And we begin to understand and to see that the power of the kingdom of God is at our disposal. And that we need not fear evil. Even when the gremlins get into our audio system and turn off my microphone. Because I have an alternative in God's grace. God's grace will triumph always. Maybe not in the moment, but in the end. That is what we heard read to us from the book of Revelation. The grace of God is powerful, and that in the end, evil will never, ever overcome. That we will overcome by the grace of Christ. We, as God's children, as St. John describes us, have already been washed in the blood of the Lamb. We ourselves actually have the power to reach through that thin veil, not to be afraid of the spirits on the other side, but in fact to enter ourselves into the kingdom of God and to be taken into that kingdom, which is a place not of this world. And it doesn't exist in a faraway place, but as Jesus said, is all around us. All around us and even within us. All we need to do is open our eyes to see it. To take the veil that veils us away. And by the grace of God, to see it alive in us. We have the power. We have the capacity. As Jesus lays it out for us. Blessed are those who are poor, who are meek, who are humble of heart. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, and who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for those who are merciful. These are the values of the kingdom of God. And if they are our values, they have come to us across that thin veil, from God's heart and mind into our own. And the more we live in that world, soon and very soon, we will stand before the throne like those elders, and we too will sing, Holy, holy, holy. This day is not about a faraway place. This day is about you and how you are being called to be the saints of God in our generation, and how a generation yet to come will look back at you and see the example of how the gospel can be lived in this world. They will see you and say, yes, you are the ones who understood, who touched the face of Jesus, and are able to see the way to peace and righteousness. You are the ones who understand the heart of God. You are the ones that we must imitate, so that we too can reach into that thin place. Those that have gone before us, they are here, all around us, a great cloud of witnesses. They're not standing in some faraway place. They are right here, right now, right there. Where are you?